I wasn't expecting praise. I've worked in tech long enough to know that acknowledgement often arrives late, if it arrives at all. But what I wasn't expecting was erasure. Not failure, not criticism, just the soft, strategic kind of disappearance that happens when someone in power decides they're done seeing you. I had delivered everything the company asked for: feature rollouts on time, metrics that beat expectations, roadmap alignment across 3 departments, and stakeholder feedback that never dropped below excellent. My team hit our milestones. Our product adoption rates doubled. I had peer endorsements from engineering and CX. So when I was called into my performance review, I assumed it would be neutral, maybe even quietly positive. But it wasn't. The language was vague. We've had some concerns about visibility. Your leadership presence could be stronger. There have been questions about alignment. I asked for specifics. There were none. I asked for metrics. None were offered. Just a lingering sentence at the end. We're not saying anything is wrong. We just want to see more next cycle. I left the meeting with a printed version of the review in my hands and no idea what I was supposed to improve. It was the kind of review designed to be unprovable, the kind that gives cover for a decision already made. A week later, the role I had been informally promised, a team lead position for a new vertical I'd scoped and advocated for, was posted publicly. 2 days after that, it was filled, internally, by someone who had never worked in product strategy, but who had lunch with the VP every other Friday. No announcement was made, just a Slack message. Please welcome X to their new role. We're excited about this next phase. I read the message twice, not because I didn't understand it, because I did. Perfectly. The bad review hadn't been feedback. It had been pretext, a paper trail, a soft, quiet demotion disguised as professional development. And I knew what would come next. Fewer assignments, fewer stretch projects, fewer mentions in leadership updates. Slowly, invisibly, I would be positioned as not quite ready. Not because I lacked results, but because I no longer fit someone else's plan. I didn't reply. I didn't ask questions. I just downloaded the review, saved a copy, and opened a blank folder on my personal drive. I named it The Work That Still Speaks. In the weeks that followed, the distance became tactical. The new team lead was looped into meetings I used to drive. Strategy calls were scheduled without me, despite the roadmap still being based on my original draft. Documents I created were repackaged under someone else's name. My metrics were still used, but stripped of attribution. No one said I'd been replaced. They just behaved like I'd never been there to begin with. When I asked for feedback on my roadmap revisions, the response was, "Thanks, we'll take a look and incorporate what aligns." When I followed up on a strategic sprint I'd been overseeing, the PM replied, "We've shifted that under new leadership. Let's connect later if needed." But later never came. One by one, the doors closed, not with slams, but with polite nods and corporate phrasing. I stopped being consulted, then I stopped being informed. And finally, I stopped being acknowledged, but I didn't fight it, I didn't defend myself. I'd seen how that story plays out, especially for women in tech who push back without permission. The words difficult and uncooperative show up faster than justice, so I did the only thing I knew would protect me. I documented everything, not in anger, in order. Emails from leadership thanking me for the Q2 turnaround, screenshots of internal dashboards where my strategies drove lift, customer quotes referencing features I had built. I wasn't building a case, I was building clarity. Not for them, for me. I also stopped volunteering. I stopped raising my hand in meetings that didn't want my voice. I delivered exactly what was asked. Nothing less, but no longer more. My energy shifted, quietly, deliberately. I began spending evenings updating my portfolio. I refreshed my resume, not the way recruiters tell you to, but the way only someone with battle scars does. I added context behind outcomes, metrics tied to complexity, value that couldn't be spun into someone else's credit. And I reactivated the networks I had neglected while over-delivering for a company that now acted like I was a liability instead of a leader. I didn't say anything to anyone. I didn't hint that I was leaving. I didn't ask if anyone had noticed the silence, because they had, and their indifference was the answer. So I poured everything I had once offered freely, strategic thinking, creative insight, problem-solving energy, into a private plan they'd never see. Not to escape, to evolve. They gave me a bad review without evidence, but I was about to show them something stronger than rebuttal. Momentum they couldn't stop, because they never saw it coming. I stopped reacting. That was the beginning of my clarity. For weeks, I had been caught in the tension between disbelief and restraint, trying to understand how years of consistent performance could be reduced to a few lines of vague feedback. But once I let go of the need to explain or be understood, I found something sharper: direction. I no longer checked Slack for mentions. I stopped hoping for clarity from leadership that had already decided to revise my narrative without me. I still did my job, I still delivered, but emotionally, I left the building. My energy turned inward. I returned to every project I had touched over the last 2 years. I pulled numbers, mapped before and after metrics, collected screenshots of dashboards, Jira boards, archived feedback, customer wins. I stitched together a private timeline of results that no one could take from me. Not a rebuttal, a record, not to prove something to them, but to remind myself that their story wasn't the full one. It wasn't even the true one. In parallel, I opened up a spreadsheet titled Options, the first tab. People I'd worked with who had moved on and thrived. The second, companies I respected, leaders who led quietly, cultures that didn't confuse visibility with value. I reached out selectively. No complaints, no desperation, just, hey, I've been reflecting and looking to grow into something sharper. Would love your thoughts. The conversation started small. A reply here, a coffee chat there. But they had one thing in common. Every person I spoke to remembered my work more clearly than the company I was still working for. I updated my portfolio piece by piece. Each project distilled into impact, not just participation. I rebuilt my public profile to reflect what the internal one no longer did. And most importantly, I began interviewing. Quietly, precisely. I wasn't looking for a lifeboat, I was looking for a platform. A place where depth wasn't an inconvenience. Back at work, nothing changed. Or rather, everything kept changing in the same direction. More assignments handed to others, more of my documentation reworded and passed off. The same people who once praised my thinking now treated it as an invisible utility. Useful, but unnamed. I didn't correct them. I let them build with borrowed pieces because I had already moved on, and they didn't even know it. While they measured performance and visibility, I was building leverage. In silence, in structure. In strategy they didn't see. They thought they'd sidelined me, but they had only freed me from the illusion that this was the only room worth being in. By the time the Q4 planning cycle began, I was operating on 2 timelines. One public, one private. In the first, I was still a dependable middle-tier contributor. I turned in deliverables, joined syncs, documented requirements, and nodded through strategy sessions that once centered on my input, now rerouted through newer, safer voices. In the second, I was sharpening my escape, not as an act of rebellion, as an act of self-preservation. Every night after logging off, I refined my materials. I cleaned case studies, anonymized data, wrote rationales behind every decision I'd made that led to measurable product success. I took the stories they'd hollowed out and gave them spine again, framing not just what I'd built, but how I had seen what others missed. A recruiter I had spoken to 6 months earlier reached out again, this time with something real. A strategic role at a growing company with no product bloat, no internal politics, and an executive team looking for clarity, not clout. I smiled at the message. I didn't reply right away. I wanted to be sure. In the meantime, I kept watching. Leadership continued to act as though nothing was wrong. The new team lead shared a revised roadmap that looked suspiciously like mine from 2 quarters earlier, except slower, stripped of nuance and padded with filler for visibility. One of the engineers pinged me separately. Didn't you already do this? I answered simply, yes, I did, but this version seems more comfortable to present. No bitterness, just truth. Quiet enough to pass unnoticed, loud enough to register. Round me, the symptoms of broken leadership became routine. Deadlines missed without consequence. Team morale dropping subtly but steadily. Meetings where more time was spent posturing than planning. No one said the word, but it hung in the air. Stagnation. The kind of slow drift that happens when competence is replaced with convenience. And yet, I stayed calm. I had already started saying goodbye. What they never understood was that while they were busy managing impressions, I was building options. And options are the purest form of power. I had 3 offers within the span of 2 weeks, each one better than the one before. Better scope, better culture, better leadership, and most importantly, a recognition of the very traits they had tried to mute: depth, precision, long-range thinking. I didn't rush. I took my time, evaluated each, and chose the one where I saw room to grow, not just room to exist. I accepted the offer in silence. No announcement, no hint, just a new beginning waiting quietly behind the old system they thought would contain me. They had taken away their version of my future, so I built my own, not in reaction, but in readiness. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. A month after I accepted the offer, but before I submitted my notice, the product I had helped shape from the ground up hit a milestone no one had expected. Customer adoption surged, driven by a feature that leadership had deprioritized until engineering quietly built it based on my original prototype specs. Feedback poured in, customer testimonials, improved retention rates, even organic promotion on user forums. The numbers told a clear story, and every person trying to explain the success was forced to trace the origin. And that origin led straight back to me. I watched it unfold like someone watching a version of themselves reappear. Unexpected, inconvenient, but undeniable. My name came up in meetings again. Softly, then more frequently. Internal teams began digging through old documentation and realized the systems they were praising had my fingerprints on them. The new roadmap was built on the skeleton of my original vision. People started asking questions. Not to me, but around me. Didn't Naomi lead that early build? Wasn't she the one who flagged that use case last year? The answers were always hesitant, half acknowledged, because admitting it out loud would mean acknowledging everything that had been done to push me out. The vague review, the missed promotion, the months of silence they had constructed to make me small. Now, that silence was cracking under the weight of proof. Even clients started noticing. One enterprise partner reached out to ask about the rationale behind the product's direction. They mentioned a workshop I had led 8 months ago, said it was the clearest explanation of product market fit they'd seen. The new team lead tried to respond, but the language was generic, and the client, unsatisfied, asked to speak with me directly. The request was forwarded, hesitantly, and I agreed. On the call, I answered their questions as if nothing had changed, because for me, nothing had, except the setting. I was already mentally gone, but my work had stayed behind. That was the unraveling. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a scandal, just the slow, unavoidable realization that erasing someone's name doesn't erase their impact. And now the company was left trying to reattach authorship to a structure they had spent months pretending I hadn't built. And I didn't say a word. I just kept delivering, day by day, until the last deliverable was complete. My departure was scheduled, the letter drafted, the silence almost over. But before it was, the system that tried to erase me was starting to remember, because the results refused to let them forget. It's easy to overlook someone when you think you've replaced them. It's harder when their absence starts speaking louder than your structure. That was what began to happen in the final weeks before I left. My manager, who once offered feedback so vague it could apply to anyone, started asking very specific questions. Where was the original messaging matrix for the Q1 rollout? Could I help clarify the logic behind the segmentation we used for the beta test? Was there documentation on how we aligned product features with the onboarding team? Of course there was. I had built all of it, but now he wasn't just asking for materials. He was asking for memory. The kind of organizational memory that can't be transferred with a title or absorbed through osmosis. And I gave him what he asked for, calmly, neatly, with timestamps, links, and zero emotion. Not because I wanted to help him, because I wanted the work to survive me. That was the difference. I wasn't leaving to punish anyone. I was leaving to honor what I had built, somewhere it could grow. Word started to spread, not formally, just the way it always does when someone who was treated as background suddenly becomes the thread holding things together. I began receiving DMs from people I hadn't spoken to in months, some asking questions they couldn't ask publicly, others just saying what they hadn't said before. You made more impact than they let on. I learned a lot from how you handled this. I'm sorry for how it played out. One colleague asked if I was going to stay after all, now that leadership seemed to see the value again. I told her the truth. They don't see me, they see what they lost. That's not the same thing. And it wasn't. Recognition after the fact isn't respect, it's regret. And I wasn't interested in being recast as valuable only after my exit made the value undeniable. I had already signed the offer. My future had already begun. I had met the new team. I had felt what it was like to be welcomed without having to prove my worth twice. Still, I stayed until the end. I wrapped projects, transitioned knowledge, gave closure to every single thing I had started. Not because they deserved it, because I did. I left no room for distortion, no room for a final footnote claiming I'd walked away out of frustration. I walked away finished, and the company, once so quick to label me hard to promote, was now scrambling to cover the space I had filled without recognition. The unraveling wasn't public, but it was precise. And now the silence they had once curated so carefully was beginning to echo in all the places I used to hold together. The official exit was clean, no exit interview drama, no awkward goodbyes in all-hands meetings. Just a final Slack message, 2 lines long. Naomi's last day is Friday. Please join us in thanking her for her contributions. There was no mention of what those contributions were. No mention of the product turnaround, or the cross-functional launches, or the quiet infrastructure I had built to keep their roadmap coherent through chaos. Just contributions. The kind of word you use when you don't want to name the thing you lost. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because while leadership was eager to move on, the systems I left behind didn't let them. 2 weeks after I left, a senior stakeholder from marketing reached out, outside of work, to my personal email. She said they had tried to run the next phase of the go-to-market strategy and hit a wall. "We're trying to trace the messaging logic you used for feature rollout," she wrote. "No one can explain where the insights came from." I didn't answer, not to be unkind, but because the answer was already there. In the dashboards I had left behind, in the playbooks that had my name in the metadata, in the structures they had used without realizing where they came from. The truth is, I had never needed them to say it, but now they needed to admit it, at least to themselves. Internally, the pace began to slip. Product reviews dragged, launches stalled. The new lead, the one they had favored for being better aligned, struggled to provide rationale when asked for forward vision. The weekly product syncs became tense. There were more questions than answers, more rewrites than approvals. One engineer, known for keeping to himself, reportedly said during a roadmap review, "Honestly, this was smoother when Naomi ran it." The room went quiet. A month after my departure, a partner company I had cultivated reached out to request the original point of contact for an integration we had been scoping for Q2. My name was still in their notes. They weren't interested in being handed off. They wanted continuity, but there was none left to give. That's what collapse looks like in clean offices and polished slide decks. Not shouting, not lawsuits, just the slow erosion of clarity masked by overconfidence. The company had confused retention with respect, process with permanence. They had assumed that because I was quiet, I was replaceable. But systems don't remember confidence. They remember care. And now, with every meeting that ended in confusion, with every team scrambling for direction, they weren't just feeling my absence, they were living inside it. By the end of the quarter, the cracks had turned into gaps. What was once brushed off as transition friction was now obvious structural failure. Deliverables slipped, internal deadlines turned fluid, messaging lacked cohesion. New product iterations were delayed because no one could trace the logic behind prior decisions. And the documents they relied on were incomplete, scattered, or misaligned. My absence wasn't loud, but it was systemic. It wasn't that I was irreplaceable. It was that they hadn't bothered to understand what I did before trying to replace me. I began hearing from former colleagues, not out of nostalgia, but confusion. "Where did you keep the roadmap notes? Do you remember why we deprioritized that feature? Do you have a version of the GTM brief from last fall?" I responded politely where I could, but with boundaries. I was no longer theirs to lean on, and the company, which once believed it could cut me from the story without consequence, was learning what happens when you remove the foundation and expect the frame to stand. The new team lead, the one who'd been fast-tracked over me, started retreating. Ideas that once came with certainty were now accompanied by follow-ups and backtracking. Her updates grew more surface level, padded with buzzwords and soft commitments. People noticed. One engineer confided, "She doesn't really get the product. She's managing people, not momentum." I nodded, not with satisfaction, but with the clarity that this had never been about revenge. It was about remembering what happens when real work is erased for convenience. Eventually, leadership tried to regain control. A new product transformation task force was formed. External consultants were brought in. Frameworks were reintroduced, ironically similar to the ones I had built internally the year before. Slack channels that once ignored my documentation now filled with questions about what had been missed, misfiled, misunderstood. I watched from the outside as the system tried to reinvent what it had quietly dismantled. But reinvention without acknowledgement is just repetition. And they were repeating all the wrong lessons. The final signal came 3 months after my exit. A job posting went live, Director of Product Strategy, seeking proven builder with cross-functional leadership, clear strategic vision, and deep execution experience. I recognized the job description. It was my shadow, written after the light had already moved on. They had once labeled me not quite ready. Now they were trying to rehire what they had let walk out the door, but I was gone. And what they failed to retain had become the one thing they couldn't rebuild: coherence. Because impact, once removed, doesn't leave silence. It leaves confusion, and that confusion was now the air they breathed. I didn't announce my new role publicly. I updated my LinkedIn quietly, with no caption and no commentary. Just a change in title, a shift in place, and a silence that said more than any farewell post ever could. The reactions came anyway. Private messages, quiet congratulations. A few teammates from my old job liked the update without saying anything at all. But they didn't need to. They knew, everyone knew. My new team was smaller, sharper, and more intentional. I didn't need to prove myself in the first 30 days. I wasn't asked to summarize my vision into 3 buzzwords or perform alignment in meetings that didn't mean anything. The founder sat with me on day 1 and said, "We've seen what happens when product is driven by people who only want to be seen. We hired you to build, not to charm." I believed him. Within the first month, I had already rolled out a lean product discovery process, rebuilt the insight sharing structure between design and engineering, and mapped a 1-year roadmap rooted not in speed, but in clarity. People listened, not because I demanded space, but because the space was already there. It was the first time I felt like I was in the right room without having to audition for it. Still, I didn't forget where I came from, not in bitterness, but in blueprint. I carried the lessons, the discipline, the restraint that being overlooked had taught me. I knew what it meant to build alone. I knew how to lead without a spotlight. And now, with the right team, I had the tools to teach others how to do the same. I started mentoring 2 junior PMs, women, both early in their careers, both already encountering the edges of invisibility. I told them what no one had told me when I started. If your work feels like it's disappearing, document everything. You're not building for applause, you're building a trail. I didn't train them to be louder, I trained them to be sharper. To write in a way that outlasts editing. To ship in a way that cannot be separated from strategy. Meanwhile, people from my old company kept reaching out. Some asked about openings, others just wanted to talk. I never responded with pettiness. I offered what I could. Because I had already moved on, not just physically, but structurally. I wasn't part of their system anymore. I was building a better one. And quietly, I knew my legacy wouldn't be in titles or applause. It would be in the systems I left behind, and the systems I was now trusted to build from the beginning. I never returned to explain myself. I didn't wait for an apology or for the message that sometimes comes when a system realizes too late what it let go. I didn't need validation from the place that had chosen performance over presence, metrics over meaning, impression over integrity. My work had already spoken in the way that mattered. It had endured, and where I had landed, it was no longer an afterthought. It was the architecture. At the new company, I built not just product, but culture. I embedded quiet rigor into everything. How we scoped features, how we handled dissent, how we defined success beyond vanity metrics. I normalized attribution, I formalized documentation. I created a rule. If you inherit a decision, you also inherit the history that shaped it. No more rewriting who contributed based on who was loudest in the room. My team didn't just ship, we remembered, and in that, we didn't repeat. I became known for a kind of leadership that doesn't ask for a stage, one that teaches others how to be unshakable, even when unseen. My meetings weren't long, but they were complete. My decisions weren't fast, but they were final. I wasn't interested in being inspirational. I was interested in being consistent, and in time, that became the standard. Former colleagues continued to reach out. Some asked if I'd ever return. I wouldn't, not because I was angry, but because I had found what they never offered. A place that didn't just use my mind, but trusted it. I had no desire to re-enter a system that only recognized value once it was gone. I had built something better. And it wasn't just about title or salary or scope. It was about peace and power. The kind you earn when you walk away without burning anything, only to light something new. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not that I proved them wrong, but that I never needed to. Not that I outperformed their expectations, but that I made their expectations irrelevant because when they gave me a bad review with no reason, they thought they were limiting my future. They were just redirecting it into a space where I would no longer be managed. I would be trusted and eventually remembered, but only in the quiet way that matters most, not in story, but in structure.